In this episode, we're going to explore the historical accuracy of Unsung Hero. The movie tells the true story of the Smallbone family and their early struggles after arriving in America from Australia with almost no money. The film focuses on the musical rise of their oldest child, Rebecca Smallbone, who fans know by her stage name, Rebecca St. James. Two of the family's other children, Joel and Luke Smallbone, who are depicted as youngsters in the film, went on to become the frontmen for the multi-Grammy-winning Christian pop duo For King and Country. Joel Smallbone actually portrays his father David in the film, as well as co-directing the movie. Actress Daisy Betts portrays their mother, Helen Smallbone, who we come to learn is the unsung hero of the story. The movie changes the Smallbones' true story in a number of ways, including condensing and rearranging events in their timeline, as well as creating composite characters to represent some of the various people who helped them along the way. I'm also going to reveal one rather significant change that the film makes, which might surprise you. This is Unsung Hero, History versus Hollywood. At the beginning of Unsung Hero, the father, David Smallbone, is working as a successful concert promoter in Australia. He runs his own small company and he brings in acts like the Christian metal band Stryper, and he feels that he's ready to take things to the next level. He strikes a deal to bring Amy Grant to Australia for a tour. In the movie, there's an unforeseen recession in Australia, and not as many people buy tickets, and David suffers a huge loss. In real life, attendance came in about 40% lower than he expected, and he suffered a loss of about $250,000. Now, in all the research I conducted for this video and my article over on historyversushollywood.com, it was only while watching the movie that I finally learned that Amy Grant was the tour that David lost a fortune on. Even in Helen Smallbone's book, Behind the Lights, she never mentions Amy Grant by name. She just says that there was one major artist that David still wanted to host. On her Instagram, Amy Grant more or less confirmed that this is accurate, saying, "And like in the movie I Can Only Imagine, you may see a depiction of me in this movie as well, only this time in Australia no less." In Helen Smallbone's book, she never makes it clear why the Amy Grant tour that David promoted didn't do well. She only says that due to unforeseen circumstances, the Australian audience did not show support as they had in the past. The movie citing that it was due to a recession in Australia appears to be accurate because there was a significant recession in Australia in the early 1990s. In the movie, Helen, portrayed by Daisy Betts, throws David a surprise birthday party for his 40th birthday, and it's on the same day that he realizes he's lost everything on the Amy Grant tour. He did go to the tour manager and asked if he could pay less to Amy Grant as his part of the contract, to which the tour manager laughed him off and said, "Hey man, we've lived up to our side of the bargain. You signed the contract." This conversation happened at one of the concerts on the tour, and Helen overheard it from the dressing room next door, and this was prior to his 40th birthday party. David did receive bad news on his 40th birthday. He had recorded 2 albums with the praise and worship group at the church he attended, and when the church caught wind of the popularity of the albums, they decided to take over and they forced David out. This was the news he received in real life on the day of his surprise party. By then, they knew they had to sell their home and downsize in order to pay off some of their debt, and in the movie, they moved to America at this point, but in real life, they rented a tiny 3-bedroom home in Brisbane, which was not far from David's family. They actually didn't move to America until about 3 years later. Something that the film fictionalizes with regard to the daughter, Rebecca Smallbone, is that she's shown as being very wet behind the ears as a singer. She doesn't sing for other people until after they arrive in America, and she auditions for a record deal. She's shown as being nervous and she struggles to find her voice. This is all a bit of an exaggeration. Rebecca had sung at church and in youth groups, and she had been part of a Christian rock band at school in Australia. She had also performed as a supporting act for Carmen during his tour in Australia that David promoted. She sung 3 praise and worship songs at each concert. Prior to going to America, David had even made a recording of Rebecca singing Australian praise and worship songs to see if he could shop it around in America to get her a record deal. David and Helen were concerned about throwing her to the wolves, so to speak, but this is a bit played up in the film. David did develop an arrangement with Carmen to set up a record and promotions company just for him in America following his Australian tour. Like in the movie, this would mean David would move his whole family to America. Carmen bought them plane tickets for the whole family to come to America after his Australian tour. However, during the tour, a pastor at a church in Adelaide, Australia, where Carmen was going to perform, got in his ear and told him about David and how he was a failure and had just lost everything on the Amy Grant tour. Why would you want to associate your name with his, the pastor said. When Carmen went back to America following the tour, he called David and backed out of their arrangement, saying he didn't think it was going to work. In the movie, to make things more dramatic, Carmen backs out of the deal after they've already moved to America. Carmen had wanted the plane tickets back, but after praying about it, David and Helen told him no. After all, they had sold their house and furniture in preparation for the move, as well as pulled their kids out of school. As Helen stated in her book, letting them keep the plane tickets was the least Carmen could do for them. Before going to America, David did line up a job to be the associate manager of an artist named David Meese, who he had worked with before. It was that job that later fell through after they were in America when his employment with Meese was discontinued because he could no longer afford to pay David. Part of the reason they decided ultimately to come to America was because David felt that there wasn't enough opportunity to promote Christian musicians in Australia. Australia has about the same landmass as the United States, but only about 7% of the population, meaning that the people are a lot more spread out and it takes a lot more effort to promote tours in Australia. To make matters worse, there was a relatively small market for Christian music in Australia, as only about 5% of Australia's 20 million people were committed Christians. When they came to America, they brought 16 suitcases. They were allowed just 2 per person on the flight. They were flagged by an immigration officer who pulled them aside into an office because he wondered why there were so many people for just a 6-month visa. Helen, who was pregnant with Libby at the time, did try to hide her bulging belly from the immigration officers. In Unsung Hero, Rebecca starts to sing to calm the family. There's no mention of this in Helen Smallbone's book, only that Rebecca started to break down and cry. In the movie, the immigration officers find a note from Helen's mother, which says that she believes it's not going to work out and they'll be back in a few months. However, this is fictional. This is not mentioned in her book. In her book, she simply states that they questioned them for about an hour and held them, and they found no reason to keep them any longer, so they let them go. Even if there was no note that the immigration officers found in real life, it is true that Helen's mother believed it wouldn't be long before they would be back in Australia. In fact, she would call on a monthly basis and try to convince Helen to come back home, to which Helen stood her ground. In real life, they stayed with some friends in LA before they took trains to Nashville. One of the things that they don't tell you in the film is that one of the trains they were on had to stop unexpectedly because the train had run over a homeless person and they had to wait until the coroner came before they could start up again. They did arrive at the home they were renting in Nashville, and there was virtually no furniture. The owner did leave a mattress behind for Helen because he heard she was pregnant, and he couldn't live with himself knowing she'd be sleeping on the floor. According to the true story, Helen did make beds for the kids by stuffing sheets around their winter clothes. She used sweaters and stuffed them into the pillowcases in order to make pillows. It's also true that the kids played cricket in the home's empty living room. It's true that they were given jobs raking leaves after people noticed them raking their own yard. Of the family's dire situation financially, Rebecca Smallbone commented, "My mom was pregnant with my sister and we had nothing. And so what we did is we prayed and we asked God for money, for food, for a car, for furniture, for all the things that we needed. God answered their prayers. People showed up at their house with groceries and unexpected checks arrived in the mail. A local church pulled together to buy them furniture, and they were given a practically new washer and dryer. They were eventually given a lawnmower and a riding mower, and they started to mow lawns as well, in addition to raking and cleaning houses. In the movie, they dramatized the delivery of the Smallbones' youngest child, Libby, a bit, by having there be complications around the pregnancy, and there's a fear that Helen might die right after Libby is born. This results in Helen having to stay in the hospital for several days. In real life, there was a concern that Helen might need an emergency hysterectomy right after delivery, but everything went fine. In fact, in her book, Helen states, "All I know was that things couldn't have gone more smoothly." The brief scare after the delivery in the movie is fictional. In the movie, somebody pays their hospital bill of several $1,000s, and it's fully implied that that's their friends, Jed and Kay Albright, portrayed by Lucas Black and Candace Bure. In real life, there was a doctor's bill and a hospital bill, and each totaled several $1,000s. Somebody did pay the doctor's bill, but Helen states in their book that they never learned who paid that bill. David did set up a payment plan to pay the hospital bill, and they asked him how much he could afford, and he said $200 a month, which they agreed to, and he ended up paying that off several years later. Their friends who helped them in the movie, Jed and Kay Albright, who are portrayed by Lucas Black and Candace Bure, are not based directly on real people. They are instead composite characters. There is no Jed and Kay Albright in Helen Smallbone's book. They most closely resemble John and Luann Moore, who loaned the family their Toyota Previa van before giving the Smallbones $10,000 to buy their own van. The Moores further helped the Smallbones financially by having Rebecca babysit and clean. Like Lucas Black's character in the movie, John Moore is described as being a prolific songwriter. Candace Bure's character, Kay, is loosely inspired by a neighbor named Kay Smith, who helped the family, including by buying extra groceries when she went to the store and dropping them off. During an interview with CBN News, Candace Bure described her character Kay as being a little bit of a mashup between a couple of other people that were in their lives. They kind of made her into one character, she said. In the movie, they show up at the home of Eddie DeGarmo to rake his leaves, and Eddie and David immediately realize that they know each other because David had previously tried to bring Eddie on as a client, and Eddie turned him down. While the real Eddie DeGarmo says that the Smallbone family did show up at his home to rake his leaves, and he gave them a job because he could see that they were struggling, I found no evidence that Eddie and David previously knew each other. At least it's not mentioned in Helen Smallbone's book. Eddie having previously turned down David to be his promoter appears to be fictional. In the movie, the musician turned music executive Eddie DeGarmo is portrayed by Jonathan Jackson, who is best known for his role as Lucky Spencer on the soap opera General Hospital. In the movie, David Smallbone is embarrassed to go to Eddie DeGarmo, who is the part owner of Forefront Records, to ask for an audition for his daughter Rebecca. He feels he would be begging the man who had previously rejected him and whose toilets he is now scrubbing. David snaps at Rebecca and Helen responds by slapping David in the face. It's a dramatic scene, but it never happened in real life. In Helen Smallbone's book, she does mention slapping her husband David across the face, but it happened roughly a decade earlier under different circumstances while they were still living in Australia. David was working long hours to grow his promotion company, Rima, and he would often come home late and miss dinner. Helen would call him and he would say he's just finishing up, but he would still arrive home late. One night, when he came home late again, she broke and slapped him across the face when he walked in. The scene in the movie where Rebecca Smallbone is about to get a deal with a record company only for it to fall through at the last minute is based on the true story. Word Records was trying to decide between signing Rebecca or one of two other artists. But as it got closer to the date for deciding, the family was told that the deal had fallen through at the last minute. In her book, Helen Smallbone described the shock they felt after they didn't get the record deal. David and I were stunned and thought, what on earth? We had been working so hard, and to have another door close. It is the only morning I can remember when neither of us could get out of bed that day. It's true that David's father, Jim Smallbone, who's portrayed by Terry O'Quinn in the film, died rather unexpectedly around this time. He died from pneumonia following a successful colostomy procedure to treat colon cancer. It's true that David had been unable to go home to Australia to attend the funeral and say goodbye to his father because they didn't have proper visas or enough money. In her book, Helen said that this has been a continual grief for David. Not saying your final goodbye to someone you love, especially someone as close as your father, is so very hard, she wrote. Rebecca Smallbone did audition for Eddie DeGarmo, who was the part owner of Forefront Records, and he came to church to watch her perform. However, in what is probably the most significant difference between the movie and real life, Rebecca Smallbone did not perform the song You Make Everything Beautiful. That song wasn't written until roughly 20 years later when she wrote it with her brother Luke Smallbone in 2011. Rebecca Smallbone instead performed Australian praise and worship songs when Eddie DeGarmo came to hear her sing at church. There's a somewhat pivotal moment earlier in the film when Rebecca is struggling to find her voice as a singer, and her mother Helen tells her, maybe you're not meant to sing other people's songs. She then begins to write her own song, You Make Everything Beautiful, and she can be heard singing it in the latter half of the film. But this is fictional. Rebecca did not begin to write her own songs until after she signed with Forefront Records. She wrote 4 of the 10 songs on her self-titled first album, which was released in January 1994. Eddie DeGarmo did suggest that she call herself Rebecca St. John, in part because, well, Smallbone isn't the most flattering or marketable name, to say the least, and also because not using her real name would give her some anonymity in her private life and help to protect her from potential stalkers. However, Rebecca didn't want to pick a name out of thin air without any meaning. Her grandmother, David's mother, suggested James after Rebecca's grandfather, James Smallbone, who had recently passed away. According to Helen, the idea tugged at their emotions, and they thought it was the perfect way to honor Grandpa Jim. Rebecca felt a rightness about it, and from then on, she became known professionally as Rebecca St. James. It's true that her family toured with her, and almost every member of her family had a job to do at her concerts, similar to how they all pitched in to help financially after they arrived in America. Her father David was her manager. Her brother Luke first ran a fog machine and later a spotlight and ended up doing lighting under her brother Daniel's supervision. Her brother Joel initially set up lights and band gear and started doing smoke. He was then taught how to manage a crew, design a stage, and be a stage manager. Joel eventually became a background singer for Rebecca. Their mother Helen says that Joel was at first very reluctant to perform on stage, but once he started to, he didn't want to stop, and he hasn't gotten off the stage since. He would go on to form the band that became For King and Country in 2007 with his brother Luke. Fittingly, the band was initially called Joel and Luke. Perhaps the most accurate thing about the movie is the role of their mother Helen, who was indeed the unsung hero of their story. The title of the movie was taken from the For King and Country song, Unsung Hero, which is about their mom and how much she meant to them and has inspired their own lives. The song helped to inspire them to move forward with making the movie. Of his mother's role in the family, son Luke Smallbone commented, "Mother, in that time of going through enormous obstacles and enormous challenges, was the person who did all the things that nobody sees but that matters significantly in every person's heart and every person's soul. And that's essentially the kind of heartbeat behind wanting to make this film." In casting their mother in the film, it was important to them to find an actress who could represent her accurately. First and foremost, it was important that she be a mother and Australian. They also looked for a brunette and someone of similar height. They ended up casting Australian actress Daisy Betts at the last minute, 10 days before production began. Betts is married with 4 children and lives in Australia. Virtually all of the Smallbone siblings have cameos in the film. For example, Rebecca Smallbone, who's better known today as Rebecca St. James, has a brief cameo as a flight attendant in the movie during the family's trip over from Australia. Her brother Luke Smallbone, who is the other half of the For King and Country duo and an executive producer on the film, has a cameo in Unsung Hero as the lead singer of the Christian metal band Striper, who can be seen performing on stage at the beginning of the movie. And perhaps the best cameo of all in Unsung Hero is that of sister Libby Smallbone, who has a cameo as a nurse who helps to deliver herself in the movie. I hope this has given you some insight into the true story behind Unsung Hero and how it compares to the movie. If you want to learn more about the historical accuracy of similar films from Kingdom Story Company and the Irwin brothers, check out our episodes on I Can Only Imagine and I Still Believe, which are linked on the screen. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Anchors away, my friends.